Stopping you from getting to the bar at happy hour, and that would be a really rough position if it weren't for such an interesting topic. We've got a really juicy topic to talk about today, and so I'm excited. And we've got a wonderful panel. I'll be introducing everybody in a minute, but I just want to set the framework of what we're going to be talking about. So today we're talking about minimizing risk on the path to carbon neutrality and net zero for corporates. And right now we're in an environment where there are a myriad of risks that corporates are facing when they go to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero. And so to just lay the framework for that, I'm going to mention some of these risks that these corporates are facing, and then our wonderful panel is going to help address some of those risks and ways to mitigate that risk right now. So one of the things for folks who've been in carbon markets, they've seen over the last 2 years, prices have risen. And nature-based solutions, that became quite a popular solution, and we saw prices actually double, which is wonderful. It allows for more project development, but from the corporate standpoint, it's difficult to budget. It's difficult to budget for how you're going to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero goals. And so we're going to talk about ways that actually corporates can mitigate that price rising and hedge against rising prices. And part of that is also looking at kind of a long-term offtake. And when you look at a long-term offtake from a project, there's a lot of under-delivery risk. And so we'll talk about ways to mitigate against that as well. We're in an environment where offsets and removals are facing quite a bit of stakeholder pushback. Ratings organizations have cropped up. We've got ICVCM coming out with core carbon principles this month. We've got VCMI determining the types of claims that corporates can make. So we've got a lot of different things going on related to the types of offsets that are created, their valuation in the marketplace, and then also what types of offsets and removals will qualify towards net zero or carbon neutrality goals in the future. There's some uncertainty there as we wait for these various initiatives to come out with the core carbon principles and to come out with the information under SBTI for qualifying removals to reach net zero by 2050. Corporates are facing all of this and wondering what they should do, and sometimes they're sitting on the sidelines and waiting, or they're ditching carbon neutrality goals and going for net zero goals, which gives them many more years out into the future to kind of wait until things are more clarified and putting off purchases. And then lastly, or second to last, corresponding adjustments. We're now in a post-2021 world. We're in a Paris-aligned world where we have countries all over the world that have their own reduction targets. And so when that means that any kind of reductions coming from those countries may need to be canceled at the national level. And there's going to be a mechanism for cancellation before those credits can be sold to corporates. And that's creating a lot of complexity. It's, these mechanisms for cancellations haven't been set up. There's concern and questions over whether or not there will need to be a cancellation at that national level. And then lastly, there's political risk. If we look outside of the United States towards development, there's a lot of political risk associated with developing those projects. So we're going to dive into all of that. And just quickly to introduce myself, my name is Lizzie Aldrich. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Anew. Anew is a merger of Element Markets and Blue Source. We each have 21 years of history in carbon offset project development in North America. Anew specializes in nature-based solutions. We have 110 forestry projects in the US and Canada. And so we're really well positioned to talk about these nature-based solutions today. And with that, I want to introduce our panel. So sitting right next to me, I've got Blake Stansell. He is President and Chief Investment Officer at Blue Source Forestry Company. And so Blue Source Forestry Company, he'll give you a little background on how that's related to Anew. Next to Blake, we've got Natalia Moudrak, and Natalie is Managing Director, Climate Resiliency at Aon. And Aon is in the insurance business and going to talk to us about mitigating these risks. So really excited to have Natalia on our panel. Next to Natalia, we've got Mike Malara. Mike is Vice President of Global Carbon at Macquarie and has been in these markets for a long time and worked for project developers and got a wealth of knowledge to share with us. And next to Mike, we've got Yuhau. Yuhau is Vice President Environmental Commodities at Morgan Stanley. He's been trading carbon for many years. Excited to hear his comments. And then Dr. Jennifer Jenkins. Jen is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Rubicon Carbon. And so just thrilled to have this panel to talk about all these uncertainties. So we're going to kick it off with a question for Blake. So Blake, tell us a little bit about how corporates can hedge against rising carbon prices in this environment where we have seen carbon go up significantly in the last 2 years.
Thanks, Lizzie. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this power-packed panel here. I think maybe the best way for me to try to speak to that question is to explain a little bit about who Blue Source Sustainable Forest Company is, and I'll use the acronym BSFC because obviously the full name is a mouthful. And I think it'll help to maybe understand a little bit about what makes us unique and what we bring to the marketplace really to help kind of answer what could be interesting going forward in terms of mitigating some of the price risk. So BSFC was formed out of a joint venture between Anew Climate and Oak Hill Advisors. The entity was formed back in 2021 with a $500 million commitment from Oak Hill. It was a unique scenario in terms of having a climate-oriented group of investors partner up with Anew Climate, the North American leader in climate solutions. The $500 million commitment was made to purchase natural forests in North America and convert from a strategy of timber focus to a strategy of climate first, primarily associated with generating carbon credits. Fast forward to 2022, the end of 2022, you went from a company that was relatively small, very well capitalized, but with only a few assets, to now the 7th largest landowner, private landowner in the United States. And that came from the purchase of the Forest Land Group and the Forest Land Group's assets. So Oak Hill made an additional investment of over $1 billion, and now we've got 1.7 million acres located in 17 different U.S. states. And we don't talk a lot about biodiversity in North America, but these assets have 1,000 miles of streams. We've got over 200 species of fish, over 200 species of birds, I think about 60 mammal species, around 120 different tree species. So something that our investors care a lot about. And then in terms of carbon projects, we have, I'll put things in 3 buckets. We have about 570,000 acres in 6 different compliance projects. These were developed under the IFM protocol in the California ARB market. We've got roughly 50,000 acres of existing voluntary projects, two projects that were developed under the ACR IFM protocol. And then the really exciting part of the business from my standpoint is about 850,000 acres that's in process for carbon development. I believe about a dozen different projects. We're going to develop those under the ACR IFM protocol. And so to bring it back around to the question at hand, I think what we really bring to the market that could be interesting and provide new opportunities going forward is number one, scale. So there's obviously scale with about 1.5 million acres of projects. And then the other thing is the touch points across the voluntary carbon value chain with our involvement in the Anew family of companies. So we're the asset owner, the asset operator, and then being a partnership with Anew, we've got touch points on carbon project design, carbon development, and then maybe most importantly, the marketing of the credits. So there's an opportunity to bring offset buyers closer to the projects, to provide risk mitigation around delivery of the credits, and then also just to provide that unique scale. And I think the other opportunities that could be talked about would be around duration. I think we can tailor some unique things in the future. Maybe I'll stop there and see if there are follow-up comments.
Great.
Or okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Blake. And when we talk about kind of a longer time scale, do you want to give an example of maybe a long-term offtake that could be offered from lands that BSFC owns, just to give people a sense for what that might look like? And then, once you do that long-term offtake, you've locked in price. So if the carbon prices go crazy, you've locked in price, and while there is an escalator on it, you know what it is, you can budget for it, and you might be well below market. So.
Yeah, we hope not to sell below market, but we obviously want to take the uncertainty out of it for the buyers. And so I think a decade would be a long time frame in today's marketplace. So we have the ability to offer more than that or a lot less than that. It's just a matter of what a buyer's looking for. But I think generally a decade is a long time.
Great, awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. So I want to turn to another member of our panel here, and Jen, I'm going to hop over to you. I want to ask you, in this world of highly scrutinized carbon offsets, can you tell us a little bit about the role that ICBCM and ratings organizations play in ensuring high-quality offsets are brought into the market? And then maybe in doing so, you can tell us a little bit about Rubicon Carbon.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Can you guys hear me? Are we? Okay, good. I always have like a crisis. So yeah, thanks. And also thank you again. It's a pleasure and an honor really to be here on the stage with this group for sure. Let me just, VCMI and ICBCM really, I guess, in the last panel we heard, we don't know yet really what they're going to say. We're all on sort of pins and needles about what they're, how is that going to shake out. So that's sort of that. We can set them aside. I'm hopeful that VCMI in particular will have workable, practical guidelines for companies about how they can make appropriate claims based on their offset purchases. That's, in my view, very important. I also agree with the prior panelists. I think Todd was up here and he said he likes the ratings agencies. I also like the ratings agencies. I think they're great. I think it's good that there are 4 of them. And I think it might be okay that they actually give different answers for the same project. For us, and maybe that it might help if I talk a little bit about Rubicon and our approach to sort of help you see why I say that. Rubicon, we're new on the market, right? So it might make some, people might not know exactly sort of what we do and how we operate. We launched publicly at the end of November, but our approach really is, we have an interesting approach to risk, right? And what we do we're essentially a decarbonization business, right? And our first product that we're offering is a portfolio of credits that are packaged into a basket that we call a Rubicon Carbon Ton. And so we're offering today 2 different baskets. We're offering a nature-based basket with nature-based emissions reductions. That's a portfolio that's backed by a set of diverse projects. And then we have an industrial emissions reductions basket. And again, that one's also backed by a series of industrial-based projects. In the nature-based portfolio, it was important for us that we focus on credits that were available for immediate retirement. So we purchased only spot credits. So we were limited in a way to the credits that are available in the market today. And in the nature-based space, That's mostly Red Plus, right? So we have our nature-based basket is entirely Red Plus. It's diverse in that it's 10 different geographies, but they are all Red Plus. In the industrial emissions reductions basket, we have landfill emission, landfill gas destruction, HFC reclamation, foam blowing agent substitution, right? Sort of your basic sort of emissions reductions projects in that space. When I think about risk, I think about risk in two sort of buckets, two time frames, right? Because I really do think that 2023 with VCMI and ICVCM and SBTI, I think we're at people have said this a few times today, and I think it's true. We are at an inflection point in this market. I think we're living right now with the impact of legacy methodologies, right? And we know a lot more now than we did when those methodologies were established. I think that's okay, right? But we do have project red credits in the market that are questioned, right? And those are we have those, some of those credits are in our portfolio, I have to be honest, right? Because they are from the legacy methodologies and they are spot credits. Going forward, the other part, and I want to talk about that in a second, how we mitigate risk in that portfolio. Going forward, we have a second arm at Rubicon. It's called Rubicon Carbon Capital, and we will be investing in high quality projects with updated methodologies that where we actually can have a hand in developing and a hand in the ongoing MRV of those projects. We'll work directly with developers. We will ensure that the credits, before they are issued, right, and that the projects and the credits are, meet the highest standards for quality. And so that's sort of a separate bucket. So let's go back to the first bucket, the spot credits, the sort of legacy methodologies. We're doing a few things. Our portfolio is actively managed, right? So when you buy a Rubicon carbon ton, you're essentially buying the right to retire at the time you retire, and you decide when you want to retire that ton. It doesn't have to be right away. It can be a few years down the road. But we're going to actively manage that portfolio until you retire your tons. When you retire your tons, you're retiring them in the proportion that was in the portfolio at the time you retired. Right? So that's, and we are actively managing that portfolio pursuant to our own internal MRV process, right? Checking them periodically. If we learn new things about a project that suggests that maybe it's not meeting our standard, we will take that project out of our Rubicon carbon ton portfolio so our customers are not subjected to the risk of quality related to that project. The other thing we're doing, and I think this is something that we should be thinking about as a larger community with respect to how to handle the project red credits that exist in the market. I'm concerned about the sort of overhang of project credits that we have in the market because we are moving, again in 2023, another piece of the inflection is moving to jurisdictional approaches, which I'm pretty excited about. But how do we handle the project level risk of over-crediting, which is sort of a baseline risk that just is present in these credits? And one of the other risk mitigation measures that we're considering and thinking about and just trying to wrap our minds around is is there a way for us to establish some sort of risk assessment around the projects in our portfolio and in a sense retire extra credits that don't go anywhere, right? That are not against anyone's emissions, but that sort of enable us to then sell the credits in the portfolio with a lot more certainty that they are going to be sort of one for one. So when someone makes a claim against those credits, they actually legitimately are reducing 1 ton of emissions. So that is our approach, and I have more to say on claims and such, but I'll save that for later.
That was great. Great overview, too, for us to understand Rubicon. And I want to encourage folks, as you have questions, we have so many awesome panelists here, we have to rely on the app. So please be jotting those down so you don't forget them, and we'll try to get to them at the end. I want to turn to Yuhau. And Yuhau, I want to ask you, how do you recommend that buyers address concerns around the stakeholder pushback, especially as it relates to forest carbon for this crew at this particular conference? How how would you recommend addressing those concerns and pushback?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And that's, as you can imagine, top of mind with all of our, many of our clients at the firm when they're looking at this market and they're trying to pick through the project space. The way I like to think about it, I mean, part of the problem here is just simply the stage of evolution of the market that we're in. Not only is there renewed scrutiny, I mean, this market's been around for a long time, but the sort of new eyes on the market in the last few years, it always comes with additional scrutiny. There's some sort of negative scrutiny, clearly, but also a lot of good work by a lot of the folks in this room to improve the product and kind of give their professional, scientific, whatever it is, market view on how to make purchases. And we've seen many presentations here. But the interesting thing is that even when everyone's even accounting for all the good work that's trying to improve the product class, that just simply adds to the uncertainty, right? Who am I going to listen to? You know, and so what I like to kind of do in my conversations with clients is, in the face of that uncertainty, the only thing you can do is try to identify things that are certain about projects, about the underlying attributes. And if you take if you just dive into the most controversial project types right now, right, reduced deforestation clearly is a hot button issue. There's a lot of media scrutiny, and it's kind of at a nadir, like it's been mentioned. I think if you take it at bottom, and the previous panel said this, the core project of reduced deforestation projects, the core purpose, is forestry conservation, right? It is not carbon. It's primarily forestry conservation. The idea of converting dollars that flow to forestry conservation, which has always been, and still, last I checked, a worthy charitable activity, right? Paying people to preserve forest lands. The trick in the offset, or the purpose of the offset market, was to take those dollars and through essentially an accounting conversion, convert them into tons. And that's where the controversy starts. It's not at the contribution of dollars to a conservation project. And it's not at the contribution of dollars that, again, even in some of the most stridently critical articles, they do substantiate the conservation efforts. They do substantiate the fact that these dollars did, in fact, reduce deforestation in these projects. What they question is that accounting conversion. They also sometimes, I was just going through an article that I annotated for a client. Paragraph 1, phantom credits, you know, scandalous, greenwashing, yada, yada. Paragraph 2, deforestation rates reduced by 75% versus historical average. Funds were contributed to the installation of a cogeneration facility at a local hospital and built roads and schools. So if you take that aspect of it, and even if you take and completely sort of write off the carbon aspect of these projects, there's still a lot of value there. So that's a concrete thing that you can grab onto. Now we turn to kind of the Rubicon model, which is another kind of thing that that's been on top of mind here, is like, can you then, because ultimately we're interested in carbon reduction and addressing climate change, can you then couple, or what is the value, or where is the trade-off of coupling these very real conservation efforts with something that is more quantifiable on the CO2 side? Can you couple that with a methane reduction project, right? And so I feel like it's important to associate, for a corporate entity to associate themselves and to identify whatever it is, SBTI or a consultant or a provider, to associate themselves with a process that they've due diligence and that they believe in. But it's also important to not disassociate themselves from the process, right? And so now can you grasp onto these things? And each element of risk in the market, and we can go through each of them. Permanence risk. Are there projects that expose you to permanence risk? Absolutely. Are there projects that don't expose you to permanence risk, leakage, additionality, right? There's spectrums of this, right? And then that kind of also informs the portfolio approach that a lot of folks have raised here. And I feel like that's, it's an early conversation. I think in a lot of this uncertainty, I think some of it is because it's carbon and because it's a new market, it feels a little overstated. There's uncertainty everywhere in anything that a corporate entity does. What is your corporate statement when there's an expose on how much fossil fuels you use, right? Do you have a statement that kind of illustrates the trade-offs that you've made and that you will stand up and defend? Every single corporate entity has that, right? And so it's not the same. We're just trying to replicate the same thing in a new market.
That was super helpful. Well, let's turn to Mike. Mike, how can corporates move forward with purchases in this post-2021 world where corresponding adjustments are uncertain? And in some places like Indonesia, they've said they won't sell credits externally if it's not for a corresponding adjustment. And so, let us know your thoughts on that. It's a tough one.
Yeah, this is the tough one.
You're up for it.
Can you guys hear me all right? I have the funky boy band headphone. Yeah, this is a tough one. I don't know how I got landed with this question. Look, maybe first I should kind of set the stage in terms of the perspective that Macquarie has on the market. We're a financial institution, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, headquartered in Australia. I sit on our global carbon team. That's within the broader commodities and global markets group. And we're in the business of investing in carbon projects, trading, retailing, wholesaling, and we're also a bank. So for those of you who've been following kind of the global banking, I won't call it a crisis, you'll know that managing risk is very important. So this is a topic that we take very seriously, any type of risk, right, with any investment we make. But I think I'll put the hat of a buyer on to kind of address this question. Obviously in the day-to-day of our business, we are constantly talking with buyers, and this is a risk that I think is becoming increasingly well-known. And it's difficult because it seems like some of these risks that we're talking about might be at odds with each other, right? We talked about how do you mitigate price, right? On the path to net zero, it's sort of prudent to think long-term. One of those issues is economics. How much is my carbon liability going to cost me in 10 years? Can I engage in a term offtake to help mitigate that? Okay, great, I find a project with a good price. Is it of high quality, right? How can I find two of those things? And then, okay, that's great. I've got a great project, good price, 10 years out. How can I be sure that a government from which this project originates doesn't just say, oops, sorry, this is towards our NDC, and whether or not you can also claim that towards your corporate footprint is sort of TBD. How do we address that? I think the first simplest way is sort of stay out of the market, right? Just buy spot on an annual basis, and you're probably pretty safe from corresponding adjustment risk if you just buy spot. But then when carbon goes to $100 a ton, as I'm pretty sure everyone in this room wants it to do, then you have a big risk there. So I think a few ways. One, diversify geographically, right? Pretty simple. If you're going to have long-term agreements, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think portfolio-level deliveries where you kind of can contractually agree with a supplier to deliver X% from different geographies, you're going to mitigate the risk that one of those countries might just claim those for their own NDC. There are other ways contractually that you can kind of mitigate the risks, right? If there is some sort of a nationalization that occurs for a credit, there are replacement credits, alternate credit clauses that you can ensure that they'll get a replacement of like kind that will have that corresponding adjustment to come with it. There's also more complicated sort of derivative contracts like option agreements, where if you really have a large exposure and you kind of want to plan for the future, you can engage in. It'll cost you less. I think that the reality is that probably a smaller part of the market is looking at that for now. If you really want to get into the weeds too, look into the country's NDC. Is the project that you're buying from in a sector that's going to be a large contributor to that country's nationally determined contribution? Since we're all talking about forestry, right? I mean, for many of the countries, particularly in the global south, that probably is going to be the case. And then how likely are they to be able to achieve that subsector NDC target with kind of what they've laid out in their NDC plan? I'll take a moment to kind of do a little bit of an aside. I think this is going to be an interesting year. It's going to be the first year that we have our global stock take for the Paris Agreement, where countries are going to basically say, here's how we're doing on our path to our NDCs. I'm definitely not an expert in this space, but we're probably going to see that countries are behind target. And I think the result of that is that could be that they start to look towards the voluntary carbon market. And that should hopefully expedite things like what we see in Indonesia, right, where they have set up their own national registry account, Regulation 21, the SRN system, where all projects need to be registered in that system. They've given pretty clear guidance now that 10 to 20% of emissions credits coming from these projects may be reserved for the NDC and then potentially re-released, depending on how that sector achieves its goal, and then another 5% for domestic emissions. So right off the bat, any project from Indonesia, you could say, well, 25% of these credits are at risk. And so if you're working with a supplier and you're engaging in a long-term offtake, ask them, what percentage of this expected issuance are you contracting forward? Is it 75%? Is it 50%? Which gives you some buffer. And that should hopefully help you to kind of mitigate the risk there. Also work with your suppliers and developers, understand, have they engaged the host country, right? Do they have some sort of a letter on how advanced is the host country in developing some sort of a corresponding adjustment or national registry system? And then lastly, and I think that Natalia will cover some of this, look for some nationalization insurance. Right? This exists in other commodity markets, and there's a lot of work, like forestry was up here, a lot of work in the insurance sector on these types of products that will mitigate this risk. So that's a lot. It's a lot to think about. I think the reality is not all buyers will kind of have the knowledge and the resources to look at that, but you do have folks, like everyone up on this panel who can kind of help advise you through that process. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Mike, that was super helpful, and I knew you were up for it. That was a doozy.
I had a cheat sheet.
I do want to just mention that if your emissions come from the country where the offset is created, for example, you're a U.S. corporate and you purchase U.S. forestry, there shouldn't be an issue of a corresponding adjustment. So it's one way to mitigate risk, is if you are located in the country, buy offsets from that country. Jen, I want to ask you a quick question, and then we're going to turn to Natalia. But there's been this kind of idea that corporates should just make a contribution approach. They should purchase offsets, and if they're concerned that they may not have a corresponding adjustment, it's just going to be like a contribution towards their ESG goals versus a compensation approach, which is most people in this room probably think of offsets purchased to reduce greenhouse gas liabilities on a one-for-one basis, reducing those tons to reach carbon neutrality. And we're entering a world where maybe the compensation approach is not getting recommended, and the contribution approach is. I want to ask you your opinion on that. Do you think we can scale markets with the contribution approach?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Somebody on the last panel, I think actually, again, it was Todd, who said this is a market that is not demand constrained. He said this market is supply constrained, right, and that there aren't enough quality projects, right? I actually think it's the other way. And the reason is because of exactly what Lizzie just said, right? What we are seeing is that companies are afraid, they're not purchasing, right? Unfortunately, they're not purchasing avoided emissions. They heavily preference removals, but removals, in case you haven't checked, are like 3% of the market today, and they're super expensive, right? Removals also aren't going to protect tropical forests. So, and they're not going to protect tropical forests in the time frame that we need them, which is right now, right? So I am really concerned because that's actually what we're seeing, right? And I think the problem is that corporates are not incentivized to make purchases today of avoided emissions credits because they are afraid that they will not be, SBTI is telling them, don't buy offsets or don't buy avoided emissions, only buy removals, and buy them later, right, when your net zero target comes around. I think that's a significant barrier to scaling the market. And my concern is that without an incentive, right, companies are voluntarily complying with they're voluntarily setting net zero targets, and they're voluntarily complying with those net zero targets today. And they're doing everything they can. They are following the mitigation hierarchy to their absolute utmost, reducing scope 1 emissions, reducing scope 2 emissions, only offsetting when there's really no other option. So, and there are situations where there is no other option, right? If you operate, for example, if you operate a skyscraper in Manhattan, you simply can't use a heat pump. It's not going to work. If you're in India, if you're operating in India and you're trying to, use renewable electricity, it may not exist where you are, right? And so in those cases, our view is it's absolutely fine for those companies to use offsets because then they're contributing to emissions reductions somewhere else. So last thing I'll say on this, we need this market to scale. We need it to scale right now. We don't have time, right? And in a philanthropic world, if a company is expected to just make a philanthropic contribution because it's the right thing to do, that's great. I hope that they do, right? I'm very concerned that it's not going to scale the market enough or as fast as we need that to happen. So,
thanks for that. Well, I want to get to Natalia. One quick question though for the audience. By show of hands, how many people in this room think the uncertainty related to the standards that provide guidance on carbon neutrality or net zero, be it the core carbon principles that are slated to actually drop this month for us to review from ICVCM, and the lack of guidance to this point on which removals qualify under SBTI is holding corporates back from taking action right now. It's leaving them on the sidelines. That's a pretty significant group. So clarity and certainty from those bodies is going to help the purchases and help us better understand this. Is it a contribution? Is it compensation? What's going to count? Because most corporates want a stamp of approval from whatever, whatever becomes the premier standard, whether it's SBTI or VCMI Net Zero Gold. Just as a quick example there, VCMI Net Zero Gold allows both avoidance and removals to qualify towards their Net Zero Gold claim, whereas SBTI only allows removals. That's a pretty big difference, and they're both saying net zero as the claim that can be made. So corporates need clarity there. Okay, Natalia, I'm so excited to get to you, and I'm sorry that you're last, but I wanted to save the solutions for the end. And this is what I think a lot of people in the room want to hear is Aon is really helping connect people to the right insurance solution. And currently, we understand there's a lot of uncertainty. Tell us a little bit about what products exist to mitigate the risk now, and which ones are kind of at the vanguard, which ones are coming, and which ones are in formation now.
Sounds great, and a pleasure to be here in person. I feel very fortunate to piggyback on so many good points already made. So I think maybe first it would be helpful to start with a philosophy, like why think about insurance and how through de-risking of carbon offset transactions, perhaps you can signal greater quality that will help build more confidence in this market and hopefully drive more and diversify the investment pool that's interested in investing in these projects. That's why we are spending quite a bit of time in looking how we can play a role in de-risking carbon offset transactions. And maybe just before getting into the weeds, also, I think another philosophical point to make, it's kind of like we have these credit rating agencies, which is great. They signal some quality and help differentiate between different projects. But maybe you can think about insurance as another stamp of quality. So as underwriters in insurance and reinsurance companies assess natural disaster, environmental, political risks, and putting their balance sheet behind it, right? They're willing to take on this risk. To you as an investor, that can also signal that, hey, this is a higher quality project. As a project developer, maybe you're able to communicate. We've taken a look, we've conducted risk assessment, we're able to actually secure insurance to some of our more material risks. We are a higher quality project. So in the future, I can envision carbon credits emerging as an asset class, and there could be insured carbon credits and uninsured carbon credits, which right away signals which one is higher quality and which one is not. But that is kind of like the vision for the future. What's the state of play today? We had excellent presentation from Phil from Forestry, I think, who laid out what's available in terms of natural disaster insurance solutions. And you know, when we started at Aeon on this journey, talking to project developers, investors, buyers, intermediaries in this space, what kind of concerns do you have in voluntary carbon markets? Where can insurance play a role? Around 2 years ago, I think this is when the wildfires were raging in California. There were droughts in the US and Europe and so on. So top of mind risk at that point was natural disaster risk. And so with many of the projects in voluntary carbon markets being forestry projects, of course, if there is a fire that wipes out your forest, which is an asset that's supposed to be generating carbon credits, you're in trouble. So we started working with clients to develop solutions where you are made whole if there was that event that occurred. So as a project developer, for example, you have money to replant the lost trees and maybe be made whole on that business interruption or revenue setback that that event has caused you, right? So that's kind of was the flavor of the day. Pest, I think pest risk has come up earlier in the morning. Somebody brought up pest and disease. Again, it's the same idea. If you have an event like a pest infestation or some disease that impacts your forest and assets are destroyed, buyers want to cover off that risk. But I think lately, most of the requests that we are getting, whether it's from project developers, investors, or buyers, is asking us to figure out what we can do around the political risk. And this is for projects that are typically located in the countries of Global South. And there's some good news and some bad news there. So in talking with our political risk leadership, there are some risks that are in the realm of familiar to the markets, what they've been taking a look at already for a while and could potentially underwrite. That includes expropriation of land rights, maybe confiscation of property and breach of contract, political violence, currency and convertibility, and so on. The new part, and this is where we're working with maybe a dozen of insurance and reinsurers carriers to develop bespoke solutions. This is where it's the risk of carbon rights that's not really certain. You know, as these frameworks are being written out, Article 6.4 is still draft, and governments are figuring out how to set up these rules and frameworks and principles. What happens if you're developing a project or you invested in a project and then a few years down the road, you no longer have rights to carbon credits that that project has generated? Then that what happens to your investment? What if you are no longer allowed to sell these carbon credits on voluntary carbon markets? Then what happens, right? That can really materially impact your revenues, right? So we have several submissions out to these innovative insurance and reinsurance carriers who are willing to explore how to tackle that risk. So I think that's positive that we have really innovative thinkers who are willing to push the boundaries and start innovating in that space. I think in terms of what else is available, there are some fraud and negligence insurance solutions that you may have heard about. There are solutions to make carbon buyers whole if the supply side contractually fails to deliver on their obligations, and some invalidation insurance solutions for compliance markets. But now I'll get to the part where it's kind of like not so good news story, like what's not in the realm of possible. We get many requests for insurance to be the hedge in price. That's something that's not, we are not seeing uptake for. There's also questions around methodology changes resulting in different baselines and therefore, you know, underperformance against what was projected. That is difficult to forecast what that impact may be. And then lately we've heard questions, I don't know if Barry's still in the room, like what if Vera goes bust? No longer is available, right? We're relying on certain entities to be here providing that service, but what if they're not there? So then can we insure that away? And we just started hearing it lately. I don't think there is a solution for Vera going bust yet, but that's sort of the flavor of the conversations that we've been hearing.
Great overview, and you can see there's a big breadth of different types of scenarios to cover. Invalidation in the voluntary markets, is that something you're looking at covering? That's something clients are actually asking for. I know for a long time it's existed within insurance markets for CCOs, California compliance offsets, but
That's something that has come up for sure. Something else I forgot that has come up actually. Is it possible to guarantee certain output levels on projects? You know how you could guarantee solar output or some other renewable energy output? Is it possible to guarantee minimum outputs on RED Plus projects? So we're actually doing a deep dive working with some data providers who have been tracking some of these projects over time to see if there is enough data to develop some kind of guarantee like that.
risk of under-delivery is a major one. And then I did want to just take 1 minute just to dig in a bit, because the buffer pool covers wind events, pest infestations, and fire. So tell us a little bit about how your insurance product intersects with that. Because, if the programs have been designed such that the site-specific buffer pool contribution would cover those, and in the event that there's a catastrophic fire, it's a shared insurance pool among everyone in that registry. So wouldn't that already cover all of those kind of risks? And then what would an insurance product do over and above that existing mechanism?
Actually, I think the interest there could be, the buffer makes the buyers whole, not necessarily the project developers who have to incur additional costs. Let's say, again, going back to that wildfire event, you're a project developer, you have experienced a loss, now you have to incur additional costs to replant the trees, and you have that loss in projected revenues. While the buffer pool credits make the buyer whole, you're still left on your own to incur the cost to be whole yourself. That's kind of one nuance. The other nuance is, some registries have nuanced percentages based on riskiness of the projects. So you may contribute 10% to the buffer pool, you may contribute 30%. Some other registries may have a uniform percentage, whereas 20% overall is contributed, right? So we are seeing requests from some project developers to see if it's possible to reduce buffer pool requirements from the project if you are, in fact, laying off some of that risk to insurance markets. And that's more like a capital efficiency play. So I think that would be a very exciting conversation to have, working with registries and project developers and together to see if there is some wiggle room to free up some of these credits if there is good risk mitigation practices in place and augmentation with insurance.
That would be great. A little flexibility in the protocol to do that
Right.
with an appropriate product. Well, this has been a power-packed panel, and I'm looking online, and I'm not seeing any questions, but please do submit them, and we could take one or two before we have cocktail hour. You guys have been great in hanging in there for some pretty dense, meaty information, and hopefully it's been helpful. All of us, I think, will be available during the cocktail hour if you want to dig in deeper, because there's certainly a lot to discuss here. Not seeing, let's see if I can refresh. I'm not seeing any questions. It looks like we might have a roaming mic as well, if anybody wants to raise their hand. Okay, if not, then I think we should close it out.
That means we covered it all.
Thanks so much for